to the streets to defend the planet, and millions of us started to organize. So Airlift is just one of the outcomes of that organizing. And we and our fellow funders in this space saw the fruits of our labors in 2018, and you saw them too. Because in 2018, the blue wave was made up of people who don't typically vote, of young people and of people of color. And it was the largest midterm turnout for 100 years. These are the people, these are the voters who'd been ignored by the party since Obama's election and had not been courted by the candidates either, because they lived in rural areas or deeply urban deprived areas in many cases. Now, compared to the amount of money that parties and candidates raise, this sector of political fundraising is microscopic. We raise a few $100 million, which sounds like a lot, but it's not these days in politics. And yet we have an outsized impact, and there are a number of reasons for that. The first is that we don't fund organizations that spend money on expensive consultants or television advertising. What we do is our groups focus on highly targeted digital ads, and the organizers that we fund are not highly paid executives, they're grassroots organizers. The second thing is that our groups are dealing with relational organizing. And when they register people to vote, they court them and they follow up with them and they form relationships with them. So they're likely to turn out those people who've been registered by our groups at something like 3x what other people who've been registered to vote by people they don't know turn out. So that's very effective. And then, you know, I think for me, one of the most fundamentally important differences with our funding is that it isn't just election cycle funding, because democracy is 365 days a year. You can't just defend democracy by voting. You need to be out there on the front lines 365 days a year, and that's what our groups are doing. In the words of Latasha Brown, who heads up Black Voters Matter, one of the most effective of our groups. It's operational in 11 states. So Latasha said recently, you know, it's not about Trump. It's not about Biden. I mean, Trump has got to go. But the election is just the beginning, because then we have to start rebuilding our democracy. And to quote the Biden campaign, building back better. Because one thing is for sure, Trump was elected because our political system right now is broken. It's been hijacked by money, and it is not meeting the needs of ordinary people. So we have just begun the work of changing that, one down ballot at a time. And now I'd like to hand it over to our founder, Danny Altman, who will explain in more depth what Airlift has been up to. Danny.
Thank you, Jenny. Sorry there isn't a music track for this. We'll work on it for next time. First, I want to thank Dakota Hall for joining us. Dakota leads one of the groups that we fund in Wisconsin. He lived through an election that has been called a dress rehearsal for November 3rd. And guess what? We won it. And I also want to thank our incredibly hardworking volunteers who have made this event possible. Jenny Tomkins, whose lovely voice you just heard, has been in this funding space way longer than any of us. Carol Karnbrot is at the controls. She tracks the money and data. And Lizzie Hersey and Allison Whitaker, two former nurses, help our events run smoothly and with lots of laughs, which we all need battlefield doses of. So here's the story of how Airlift got started. Everything is accidental, right? It began with an email from my friend Larry Litvak, who may be on this call, inviting me to attend a Tides Foundation workshop in June 2017 for big donors. At that point in my life, I had semi-recovered from the shock of Trump's election, and I was looking for a place to put my energy. I'm a strategy person. I have a company in Berkeley called 100 Monkeys that my son Eli runs. He's a funder, and I think he's on the call. We've helped hundreds of startups get off the ground, so I came to listen and to ask questions. I heard postmortems about the election. This was like June 17. Things like don't rely on big data, listen to your own people on the ground, don't take anything or anybody for granted, and my favorite, don't run an election from Brooklyn. I'm from Brooklyn, and even I agree with that one. But I also heard new strategies for winning elections. There was a very cool document at the conference called Snapshot of the Emerging Resistance. In early 17, there was an explosion of, I think it's okay to call them startups, that were rushing uninvited into the political space, all with the idea of preventing another 2016 style tragedy. So this was kind of a prospectus saying, hey, here's our idea, this is our team, this is what we're doing, and this is how much money we need. I very quickly began to see that there's a flip side to giving money to party and candidates. If you don't want to see most of your money disappear like you're at a racetrack where the only two options are winning and losing, there's a way to invest it in a whole world of local independent groups that help people fight for issues they care about. So when elections come around, people trust them because they know them, they're local, and they're in your hood all year long. Instead of funding consultants and TV, you're helping to build a lasting local progressive infrastructure. I found out that there were experts on this approach to winning elections, and I met some smart, wealthy donors who were beginning to figure out how all this worked. But somehow it seemed like a kind of secret society, so I asked some of the attendees I met, is anybody doing this online? It seemed to me to be like pretty obvious question. Is anybody helping regular people be strategic donors in this space? And they looked at me like I was from outer space, and it was obvious that they hadn't really thought about it. And they said no, so I walked out of the conference with an idea. And I also walked out with a business card. It belonged to Matt Singer, who has been the driving force behind the automatic voter registration movement. Matt, at that point, he was working at the Movement Voter Project, helped to incubate Airlift. So we had a ton of free consulting, advice from a lot of experts in the movement space, and with calling in a few favors, we went from concept to being a real funding space in 3 months on a budget of $0. We went live September 15th, 2017. And this is our, I'm going to disappear for a moment. This is our website at airlift.fund. And these are our people. Behind me, you can see some of the young and black and brown people that we're fighting for. People that this COVID epidemic has proved our fates are intertwined with. Like some other successful startups out there, we didn't really invent anything. We just took something that our team needed in our lives and built it with the help of people who had already figured it out. What we added was we made it simple and friendly and gave it a serious context so that you are the investors and we are your portfolio managers. With your donations, we have invested $1.7 million in some very powerful groups that are making democracy real for millions of people. One of the measures of our success are the states that we no longer fund. Nevada in 2018 and Virginia in 2019 became very close to being Democratic strongholds. These victories were largely fueled by the groups we funded and their allies. We left these states behind, which I have to tell you hurts because they continue to do great work, but we did it to put more resources into states like Michigan and Texas, and yes, Wisconsin. Speaking of Wisconsin, I have next to me, or almost next to me, Dakota. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dakota and I decided that the best way to set the stage is with a video about the April 7th primary, just as the pandemic was roaring to life. So that's what we're going to start off with.
Delayed action by Governor Evers, combined with Republican leadership and forcing voters to the polls during this pandemic, undoubtedly put thousands of people at risk of contracting the coronavirus. Yes, we are angry about the tens of thousands of disenfranchised voters of color, but we are more angry at the political leaders who turned this from an election to an execution. In response to the coronavirus, we pivoted to a digital-first organization to protect the safety of our staff and members. While we have always incorporated digital organizing into our work, we are an on-the-ground organization at heart. Every day, we build with and for young people around Wisconsin in 14 high schools, 9 college campuses, and in communities of color. It was not easy, but we were able to transform our organization in a matter of days to still engage with young people and communities of color throughout Wisconsin. Our impact on digital platforms led to our content being seen 2,332,205 times on different social media platforms. Our content reaching almost 891,417 people in Wisconsin. Our content directing 19,807 people to request an absentee ballot. And videos watched 332,347 times advocating people to vote yes for MPS and how to request an absentee ballot. Our digital impact was backed up by our canvassing team and staff as we switched to peer-to-peer texting and call campaigns. We sent 364,973 text messages to Wisconsin voters. We made 25,490 calls to voters reminding them to return their ballots. We sent another 132,564 messages specifically to college voters. Regardless of who the winners were, the real winner is Wisconsin's future. Because in some of our darkest moments, young people of color stepped up and showed that they have the leadership to move the state forward.
Thanks, Dakota. So my first question is, how bad was it? Tell us what was at stake in the election and tell us the outcome.
Yeah, it was one of the most chaotic moments of my life as an organizer. There were over 20 changes to our election within the final 2 weeks in terms of rules around absentee ballots, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruling, the United States Supreme Court ruling, executive orders, polling locations closing just days before the election. In my hometown of Milwaukee, we usually have about 180 polling locations, and we went down to 5 with only a few day notice. And it was a lot. And as you saw in the video there were people literally in line for miles. I had a polling location by my house, and I went out there and I tracked how far is it, and it was almost 2 miles between where the last person was and where the front began and where people were voting. But people came out and voted because they understand that democracy matters to them. And in Wisconsin, we saw 1.2 million ballots requested. That's the most we've ever had in our state, to the point where we had so many ballots requested, our state wasn't prepared and didn't have enough envelopes to send them out. And so really when Danny says this was the test run, we're seeing this stuff, right? Even right now, a federal appellate court ruled that we can extend our absentee ballot collection times, which was a big thing in September. And now we're probably going to see that once again go to the Supreme Court. And luckily for us, it's happening, in September and October and not the weekend before the election, which we saw in April. So there was a lot at stake in April, but I think we were able to do as much as we could in that moment and make sure that 1, our community was heard, but then 2, our community was protected, because we understood the risk of telling people to go vote at the first height of the pandemic when our election commission around the state could not even secure enough PPE to put out hand sanitizer and masks to everybody. But now we've been able to work and ensure that they're being held accountable to having that. But back in April, that was not the case.
Tell us about the outcome.
Yeah, the outcome, Supreme Court Justice, we were able to win a seat with somebody who was a little bit more liberal than a conservative who was a typical conservative judge who believed that the earth was born 2,000 years ago, anti-LGBT and queer rights, anti-abortion, somebody who, you know, did not represent the values that we thought that should be represented, as well as we won our local school referendum case with 80% of the vote. And now almost $100 million will be pumped into Milwaukee Public Schools, which is the largest and most diverse school district in Wisconsin, and about 90% of the students are students of color. And so now $100 million are going to go into that school for equity initiatives like increasing school nurses, increasing restorative justice practices, increasing curriculum that is based in ethnic studies to, you know, kind of unveil some of the truths about what goes on in this country in terms of race relations.
So the mother of all elections is coming on us fast. What did you learn from the April 7th fiasco? What are you focused on now?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, what we learned is Wisconsin can vote by mail, and we did it pretty cleanly, even though we had a lot of hiccups leading up to that. But in the matter of weeks, we were able, you know, to really think about pumping out $1.2 million ballots, which was not the case. You know, while Wisconsin's always been a vote by mail state, if you wanted to do that, never at what we did. So we learned that we could do that, which is really exciting for me. But two, we also learned that if we see something like we saw in April, we had to be prepared and be nimble as an organization to be flexible. So one of the big things that we had to do was March 17th, they tell us, you know, all the students that are on campuses have to go home. And our election's April, you know, that first Tuesday in April. So we only had a matter of weeks to get up and loaded to reach back out to those students and make sure they went out and go voted. And so that was also something that we learned as well too, how do we do that, right? Like, what's the digital game? Can we do mailers? How do we make sure that we're sending folks home with information was a big thing. And I see Sarah's question here is, you know, how are we reaching the many students who are absent from college campuses? In Wisconsin, everyone's back on campus. So there's no one absent right now. And Wisconsin has some pretty high cases due to that. We have one school, UW La Crosse, who 2 weeks ago, when they tested students, they were at a 70% positive rate for this one campus. We have other campuses who are not even testing students unless they have symptoms. So there's no one absent, but we're prepared to do a massive mailing as well as digital game in case that does happen and folks are sent back home. But right now, everyone's in person, which is really scary.
So could we back up a little and would you tell people how LIT got off the ground?
Yes. So LIT started to form in 2017, and not necessarily a direct relation to Trump getting elected, but the overall what we were witnessing in Wisconsin. I come out of student organizing where I was a student at UW-Milwaukee underneath the reign of Scott Walker. And what I saw when I was student organizing was budget cut after budget cut of $250 million into my university system. And knowing that we just elected Donald Trump and the following year in 2018, we had Scott Walker up for election, I knew we had to do something to mobilize young people and tell them what's going on before we lost everything and in public education. And so stuck in between an election of Donald Trump and upcoming of Scott Walker really helped us be a catalyst of social change and civic engagement of young people because we knew we couldn't have another 4 years of Scott Walker in these budget cuts. And what it would mean for Wisconsin to be underneath a third term of Scott Walker for K through 12, for higher education, for indigenous rights, for reproductive justice, and so much more that Scott Walker was undermining. Voting rights, right? Scott Walker, and the Republicans in Wisconsin laid the blueprint similar to North Carolina on how to restrict voting rights. So, here at LIT, we definitely look at, those two things as helping being a catalyst, the election of Trump, but also ensuring that Scott Walker did not get reelected.
So you started out in Milwaukee. Tell us where you are now and how many cities, how many campuses, how many high schools, how many organizers. Give us some numbers.
So when we started off, it was for the 2018 election, at that moment we had, I believe, 6 full-time staff. And so right now we have 20 full-time staff and 46 part-time staff around the state. We are organizing not just in the city of Milwaukee, but in 7 counties around Milwaukee. And these 7 counties are ones that are critical in terms of ensuring that we get a blue victory. These are the same 7 counties that we worked in for our spring election, where we won a Supreme Court race. And at minimum, in areas in which we worked, we went up +5 from the previous election. And every county that we worked in flipped red to blue if they were red previously. So we are doing pretty expansive work, and we're the largest civic engagement organization for young people in Wisconsin in these 7 counties.
So you've had some pretty cool successes, particularly for a young organization. Way before we heard the name George Floyd, you convinced the Milwaukee Board of Education to cancel their contract with the police. How did you do it?
Yeah. How did we do it? Long-term organizing, grassroots organizing, thinking towards the future. One of the things that we do that's unique to youth organizing and to engaging young people in civic engagement is we just don't focus on the vote. So we're not just on college campuses, but we're also in high schools. We often work with high schoolers who are 13 and 14 who don't get to vote, right? But we know that if we engage them at 13 and 14 in the civic engagement process and unlock civics for them and talking to them about how they can impact decisions at the local level with their school board or other school officials, and depending on the community in which you're in, that is going to be the pathway to long-term civic engagement. And the next wave of young organizers that we're going to see around this country is investing into high school organizing. We know it's one of our theories that, we're going to see Wisconsin, be a progressive powerhouse because no one else is organizing these 13 and 14-year-olds who are 4 years away from voting, right? They're at least 4 years away from hearing from the Democratic Party. They're 4 years away from hearing from any campaign, but yet every day they get to hear from LIT. And I think that's what helps make us special is we're not just confining civic engagement to who can vote and who cannot vote, because there are young people who can't vote. There are undocumented folks who can't vote. There are ex-felons who can't vote. And all of them have a home here at LIT and are helping move forward some of our initiatives around civic engagement.
I love your name, Leaders Igniting Transformation. Talk about how you create leaders. Leader feels like a step up from an organizer.
Yeah, how we create leaders is one, you'll never meet a young person when they're comfortable who doesn't have a complaint about how things can be changed. They are already motivated. It is about cultivating that energy and helping mold it through some of our great programs like Black Hogwarts. In a pre-COVID world, that is a 30-person summer camp that we pay young people to attend, and they get 6 weeks, 100 hours plus of intensive organizing training. In COVID, we did a digital learning thing where each one of our departments presented on different topics. So we had a civic engagement track, we had a high school organizing track, a college organizing track, a cultural organizing track, where people were able to just come in to Zoom meetings just like this and learn about how they can engage into democracy and civic engagement. And that's one of the ways we build leaders. We also do a lot of training internally beyond civic engagement to learn about oppression work, to learn about history. We know based on our own experiences of just being in school not too long ago, that some stuff is not taught, right? And some stuff needs to be taught. When we think about Black Wall Street and the Tulsa massacres, that is an important piece of American history that is often not taught around race relations. But we can learn a lot from what history has taught us in race relations. We can look at Reconstruction and see that during a moment back in the 1800s when Black people first got the right to vote, which is not the 60s, it's actually 1865 in Reconstruction, there were 22 Black elected officials, two in the Senate and 20 in Congress. That needs to be taught, for that way we can actually look back at our history and evaluate where have we gone and what are the missteps that we have taken. And so I think that's how we build leaders, is we educate them and we help cultivate all this energy that they have already.
You were telling me what the Kavanaugh nomination looked like through the eyes of a 16-year-old in Milwaukee. Can you share that story?
Yeah. So I think one of the misnomers is that young people didn't care about the Supreme Court. In fact, I think that's completely false, right? Young people are on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Tumblr, TikTok. And if you scroll on those and you have like the right following and you're following different people, you're going to see that content. And so even now what we're seeing with the new nomination, young people were first introduced to this 4 years ago, and they saw Brett Kavanaugh, someone who was accused of sexual assault, get to the highest court of the land. And they heard these stories of survivors come forth and not be believed. And it was, I think, for young people, an awakening of, whoa, we can't just think about the president as the thing, right? Like, we have to learn more about these systems. And so really, I think what young people were able to do after the Brett Kavanaugh was understand the Senate nomination process, the Judicial Committee, who's leading that, right? And even some of the work that we did was looking back at the Clarence Thomas nomination and Anita Hill, and saying that this isn't new. Brett Kavanaugh was not the first person. In fact, we have this Black woman here who was dragged through the mud previously, and we once again saw history repeat itself. And so I think while social media helped provide them with some political education, that's where Lit was able to be also effective too, and teaching them, like, you know what, like, you literally weren't born when Clarence Thomas was being nominated. Let's look at some of the stuff. Let's look at the film that Kerry Washington did. Let's look at, go to the YouTube and find some of these clips too, and help connect these dots that isn't there. And to Jennifer's point, like, while we were able to get some civic stuff back into there, it's really about the curriculum design and making sure that we're pushing and holding school administrators accountable to actually teach civics and not just like, oh, this is like the 3 levels of government, but like, no, let's dive deep, because young people deserve that. Because that is, you're right, like, it is absence, right? Like, and also it's intentional too. Let's remember that the school board system and the school administrators is not going to teach young people how to overthrow them and how to take control of that school system, right? Like, that's not the role of government, is to teach people how to advocate for themselves. And so that's where I think Lit can come in and push that advocacy and make sure that civics is going beyond the 3 levels, but like, what does it mean to be these 3 levels? What does it mean to be able to introduce curriculum? And so I think that's some of the benefits that we have.
So I just want to switch gears for a minute. I'm not sure that people really understand that a group like Lit is part of an ecosystem of dozens of groups that are working together in a statewide context. Can you talk a little bit about how this cooperation works? Can you give us an example of where that cooperation paid off?
Absolutely. So the Wisconsin ecosystem is one of these things that we really had to do intentionally, right? And it's being built up, right? Like, after 2016, we recognized that there were gaps, intentional gaps from people thinking that Wisconsin was good. So organizations didn't get funded and they weren't able to sustain themselves. And so when I think about our partners like Black Leaders Organizing for Communities, Bolsa de la Frontera, who does amazing work on the immigrant right front, Citizen Action, who's doing groundbreaking rural organizing and co-op models out there, it takes all of us to work on some of these campaigns, right? All of us were working on the campaign to increase equity funding in Milwaukee public schools. And without all of us, we don't get 80% of the vote. Right. And for those who don't know, one of the reasons why that's so monumental for Milwaukee to invest into public education is Milwaukee's the home of the private charter model. And that was really born here in the early 90s. So for us to be able to come back and win with such a huge vote and trust of the public to invest in the public education was monumental. And we don't get that without us working together with other groups on collaborating on the messaging, on where we're going to make sure we're not talking to the same person twice, and having a collaborative approach and not just being siloed. We're not going to win siloed. The divide and conquer model is how Scott Walker won, and that's how we know we're not going to repeat itself.
So Pew Research says that if you register a new voter, there's a 20% chance they'll show up to vote on their own.
Yep.
What do you do to increase those odds, and what do you think is a good number?
Yeah. So all that is correct. One of the special things about Wisconsin is same-day registration, meaning that you can go to the polls and register same day. So if we're able to convince people on election day to, hey, go to the polls, we're going to automatically get that turnout, right? Like, they register and then they vote, because you're not going to the poll to register and then walk away. You're going to take that next step there. But then two, the way we actually really increase that number is doing that relational organizing and building these relationships with people, for that way they feel accountable to somebody else to go vote. And I think that's one of the things that was missing in 2016. There was no accountability to go out and vote, as well as there, Scott Walker and the Republicans putting forth all these voter suppression tactics, voter ID, residency requirements that were really confusing. We had to build these relationships with these communities to make sure they go out and vote. Young people are able to feel accountable to each other when they talk about these issues, and they're like, oh yeah, we need to go vote. Let's go vote together, or let's all request our absentee ballot on our smartphone. Let's go early vote. Let's make something out of it. And that accountability is going to help drive up these registration numbers, as well as the percentage of voting to registration. And so without relational organizing, I think you're going to see what happened in 2016, where everyone is shocked that Wisconsin, for the first time since Reagan, went red. And we are, that's why we have 20 full-time staff and 46 part-time people around the state doing this relational organizing and talking to people every day. So it's that level of investment, along with partners who are like Block, who have over 100 canvassers doing phone calls and texting, and doing it in a way that's not just transactional, but building a relationship and talking to people like they're people and not just a machine. Like, hey, you're going to go vote? Like, no, let's talk about what needs do you have, because I can help send you a link or help connect you to somebody, right? Like, do you have access to getting a free mask? Oh, no, you don't? Well, let me talk to you about how we can get a free mask. And then let's have a second conversation about what issues matter to you right now. And then that third conversation, let's talk about voting. Fourth, plan to vote. Fifth, accountability on going voting, right? There's so many layers. The 7-layer bar is my favorite dessert. And that's how I think about organizing often. I don't know if everyone calls it a 7-layer bar, but they are amazing. And, getting excited over them. What was that?
Are we talking ice cream?
No, the 7-layer bar has like coconut, some chocolate, maybe peanut butter. I don't know what's all in it. It's just amazing. Maybe it's a Wisconsin thing, just like Blue Moon ice cream. It's one of those weird things that we have.
So what are your dreams for the leaders you're developing, and where does LIT go from here?
Yeah, I think my dream for them is to be able to live their full life as young people, and eventually not have to worry about like carrying the fate of the country in politics, right? Like, some of these young people are, 18, 19, and we're counting on them to vote and save the country from this moral collapse. That's not a wait for young people, right? Like, I think that, while they're still developing, and all the science will say that, the brain isn't fully developed, there's a lot of pressure on Gen Z right now to help make up some votes and help defeat Trump. And I'm not saying that voting isn't important, but, at 19, 20, I hope we can be in a place eventually where we're not like, where candidates and parties are not whether or not people live, right? And so like, that's like my wildest dream, is like we get to a political system where we aren't literally voting for people's lives on the line, whether it's through COVID, immigration, Black lives. Like, there's so much on stake on this ballot. So that's one of the goals that I have. And I think, for LIT, it's always expanding, right? Like, we're in the 7 counties now. How do we expand into Indigenous reservations and help do amazing work there, go beyond 7 counties and go to even further northern Wisconsin. I think everywhere that we go, we tend to have success, and there's young people are like, whoa, I wish I had this here, right? Because there's no infrastructure statewide. And so as we expand, everyone's just like, whoa, we can do what? Like, I have a voice, like I can. So, those are the 2 things I'm really hoping for.
Thank you. That's very exciting to me. I think we covered a lot of territory. Have you got your eyes on the chat? You want to pick out a few questions from there?
I think I answered some of the questions.
I've got a few more.
Is there an ability to share effective strategy with groups in Wisconsin or elsewhere, or each community different? So, I think like the most effective strategy to share is that relational organizing, right? And it will differ community to community, but understanding that it's not a transactional thing and there's layers to it, I think, is the strategy, and breaking that down to people. And then you just replicate that for your own community, right? Like, if language is always going to be different, right? Like, not to be funny, but like the pop soda thing, depending on what word you use, is going to be completely different for some people. right? Sneaker, shoe, or, it's all about like how you do your language as well too. But I think the relational organizing strategy is really good. Digital strategies are often shared, right? Scripts for phone banking, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that could be shared. If you have like the race class narrative group in your state, like they will often help like provide some tools as well too around messaging that is shared. And then you take that and you put your twist to it, right? Like it's your mother hands a recipe to you. You might add a little bit more oregano than she did, right? But that fundamental thing is still there.
So
do you expect? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the race class narrative for people who may not be familiar with that?
Yeah, the race class narrative is a messaging system at its core that really talks about linguistics at a scientific level, that is able to place the intersects of race and the economy together to, one, eliminate dog whistles and call them out, but then two, be able to craft messages that are opposite of what we see on the Republican Party, right? Like a good example is how Trump will talk about jobs, this, and he'll pit Black folks against Latinx folks. He'll pit rural poor white people against communities of color on these jobs. But the race class narrative, you get to work with them on developing a message that cuts through racial and economic tensions and talks about how we're all actually together in some of this stuff, right? And when I think about this historically, I think about what MLK tried to build back in the 60s with the Poor People's Movement, right? The original version, right? And bringing together, poor whites and poor Blacks for a class-based movement that was able to cut through racial tension and talk about the policy needed. And so that's a little bit about the race class narrative, and that's how I would describe a lot of it.
So practical question. I think what some people have in their minds is that this is, does it make sense to donate so late in the game? So can you talk about the knowns and the unknowns and what you're preparing for and how that needs to be financed?
Yeah, so I mean, I will say it's never too late to give money, right? There's always scalable work, whether it is, boots on the ground, digital ads, mailers. Usually we can always do something with that, right? And even more so now, right? Like we're walking into an election where there's going to be a lot of mail-in ballots. We will not know who the president is on November 3rd. Like that, I think that is pretty much the sentiment that is pretty much agreeable. So there's going to be work afterwards as well too, for like a few weeks, right? There's going to be election protection work, making sure ballots are counted, making sure the right-wing militias aren't doing anything that is going to compromise the voting locations, right? Like, and we saw in Kenosha, right-wing militias are willing to kill people, right? We saw that with the 17-year-old who came up from Illinois and shot and killed 2 people. And so we have to be prepared for anything, right? Donald Trump yesterday told the Proud Boys to, stand back and be on standby. And so, for us and the way we're looking at it, the election doesn't end November 3rd. Because we don't know when it's going to end, after you count all these ballots and all the election protection stuff that's going to have to happen. And now with Wisconsin getting an extended deadline to count, I think up to 6 days, like, you send money on November 2nd, we're still going to need it November 4th because we just won't know.
So, okay, let's keep going with that a little bit. Talk about January, because that's where we kind of like, drop off the election cycle for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And a lot of people either, that you've invested in, you have to lay off and, stuff like that.
Yeah, so January in Wisconsin, granted we have inauguration, so we're going to be doing that, right? So there's going to be two tracks, right? Or multiple tracks, actually. So one, it's like Trump wins and we have to protect our communities. It's Biden wins and we have to hold Biden accountable for pushing stuff forward for young people, whether that's around, the Green New Deal, debt, right? Like we're approaching $2 trillion in student loan debt, and that's going to collapse the economy at some point. Or we get this really weird scenario where like Biden wins and Trump declares himself the winner because he doesn't trust absentee ballots and he tries to stay in the White House, and we have to mobilize to figure out what to do, like what that looks like. That's, it's kind of unprecedented. So we have to figure out that kind of stuff. Also in Wisconsin, for most people, January is like, yep, we're done with the election. We have an election in mid-February and then the first week of April. So for us, it's not even, we get to breathe in December and then we're back in election mode. So our cycle, really doesn't end. The longest gap in between Wisconsin elections is 10 months. which is usually the ramp time an organization needs to build up the infrastructure. So January is going to be crazy, and hopefully we know who the president is, and we have a clear path on hopefully a transition of power that's smooth and clean. But then, my goal is to be able to hold Joe Biden accountable and his administration to meeting the needs of communities in this moment. Hopefully we're not going through a Trump thing in the White House, regardless of how he tries to do it. So that's how January looks. And even beyond is we have elections in February and in April. And so and in 2022, we have Ron Johnson, who's been often named the worst senator in the United States, is up for election. We're hoping to flip that seat, as well as protect our governor, Tony Evers, who holds the most powerful veto pen in the nation. And for us, that means holding back Republicans from passing very nasty legislation around reproductive justice, LGBT rights, cutting school funding. And without that veto pen, we essentially go back to Scott Walker. So we don't want that to happen.
Thank you. We could go on, but we can't. I think we're running out of time. This has been like totally awesome. Thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Jenny, who's going to bring us to the next part of the event. Thanks, Dakota.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny and Dakota, and thank you all for hanging in there. We're running a little bit over time, and we promised you you'd be out of here within 50 minutes. But so I'm going to be really quick. I just want to introduce my colleague Ruth Yeager, because we had some questions in the chat about what about the other groups that you're also supporting, and how are they in terms of the scale that LIT is. And I just very briefly, all of our groups are incredibly impressive, and Ruth is going to tell you what they're doing right now, the other people in the portfolio that she is one of our portfolio managers is involved with. So Ruth, take it away.
Rookie mistake. Thanks, Jenny. So I'm going to be talking about how our groups are dealing with voter suppression. So I think about, there's generally three types of voter suppression. There's the legal voter suppression, purging voter rolls, eliminating polling places, and making it difficult to vote by mail. And then there's the more pernicious voter suppression, creating voter cynicism. My vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter who's in office. Creating voter confusion. How do I vote? What ID do I need to vote? And then voter intimidation, and we saw Trump encourage that last night. So you might want to know, what are our groups doing for election defense? So first of all, we just saw what Wisconsin is doing in such a great way. We saw in the video long lines of voters at the April 7th primary, leading to 50 to 70 COVID cases. Thanks to LIT for showing us how we can win in November in this COVID crisis, and for developing youth engagement that erodes electoral cynicism. Block, our other group in Wisconsin, was part of the lawsuit referenced by Dakota that vote-by-mail ballots can be counted if postmarked but not received by Election Day. Texas has closed more polling places since 2013 than any other state, almost 800. One of our groups in Texas, Move Texas, has filed lawsuits in conjunction with the Texas Civil Rights Project to expand vote-by-mail eligibility and to bring Texas in compliance with national voter registration law. And Move Texas has done a lot at the local level around advocacy. They've advocated for local offices to open additional polling places at colleges, to have 24-hour polling places to accommodate people that can't get to the polls 9 to 5. They've advocated for mega polling places at the Houston Stadium and at the AT&T Center in San Antonio. In fact, last week there was a massive voter registration in the Spurs parking lot. I'm going to tell you a story about Bexar County, which is the home to San Antonio, about how local advocacy worked there. There's an entrenched local registrar of voters in Bexar County, who essentially, actually, we were told, was too lazy to open additional polling places until a push from Move Texas succeeded in opening those polling places. And then the same registrar of voters abruptly stopped certifying deputy registrars. Those are volunteers who can register people to vote a week before National Voter Registration Day. Again, MOVE and the Texas Civil Rights Project wrote a demand letter threatening legal action. That very afternoon, certification was resumed. And MOVE has recruited over 1,200 youth poll workers to ensure that polls are adequately staffed. We've all heard about voter suppression in Georgia since the 2018 governor's race, when Stacey Abrams should be sitting in the governor's seat today. Our group in Georgia, the New Georgia Project, has won a couple of lawsuits. One, that vote by mail postage will be paid even if there's no stamp on it, and that absentee ballots will be accepted if they're postmarked on election day. They also have a program that they're called the Peanut Gallery, where they are monitoring the actions of local election boards by taking notes at meetings, detecting trends around polling closures, changes in voting practices, and they're collecting all this data in the case legal action is needed after November 3rd. And they too are recruiting poll workers. North Carolina is a key battleground state for the presidency and the Senate, with a very long history of voter intimidation. Yesterday on a call, I heard that there's, in some small rural communities where both of our airlift groups are focusing, caskets are brought to polling places. Trucks are rolling by polling places with mannequins hanging from nooses. And by the time the police are called, it's too late. So our groups, Down Home North Carolina and Carolina Federation, are working with other grassroots groups to make it safe to vote at the polls. They actually devised, I think, a really fun idea. They've got parties at the polls so that there's a welcome atmosphere at the polls. During early voting, there will be, in all 100 counties, there will be, on the weekends, they will have 6 to 8 member safety teams with water, stools for sitting, saving space in line for bathroom breaks, and to have a sense of, this is a party, come and vote, it's not going to be dangerous. Another key battleground state is Arizona, both for the presidency and the Senate. And there's a very large Latinx community that feels very disenfranchised and generally less likely to vote. One of our groups in Arizona, CASE, is in partnership with the Hospitality Workers Union to reach these low propensity voters. And the gold standard to turn young voters and voters of color into voters is person-to-person contact. CASE has worked with an epidemiologist to develop a protocol for safe door-to-door canvassing. They're bringing volunteers in from LA with a goal of 680,000 door knocks. Now the Biden campaign isn't going door-to-door, but our grassroots groups are. And Pennsylvania, a Midwest state that Trump won by 44,000 votes out of 6 million cast. One of our groups, Pennsylvania Stands Up, has already made 1 million calls to voters in support of down ballot candidates. They've made 112,000 deep canvass calls to persuadable voters to defeat Trump. They've texted 100,000 potentially unregistered voters, and they've already made over 100,000 calls to ensure that voters know how to vote by mail. Pennsylvania, their voter suppression tactic is something called the naked ballot, or voters need to use an interior envelope that's got a secrecy sleeve and then sign and date an exterior envelope. Basically, naked ballots are designed to trip up voters who aren't in the know. So bottom line, our groups are there focusing on local efforts at voter suppression and developing their own local remedies. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Ruth. I think that's very impressive and very reassuring that our groups have this in hand. And now I'd like to hand it back to Lizzie. Lizzie?
Yes. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Oh, wow. Listening to Dakota just makes my heart swell. And I know someone in the chat said you have other groups, and my gosh, like Ruth just said, we have 17 groups, and they're all working their tails off all year round, and after the election as well. So what I want to think about that makes me feel hopeful is the name Leaders Igniting Transformation, because what I think and hope and what keeps me going is that the leaders of tomorrow will not resemble the leaders of today. In other words, we won't be looking at Mitch McConnell or Lindsey Graham or the likes of some of these old guys. They're just going to be a thing of the past. We have new leaders in training. All of these groups are focusing on not only reaching the voters and turning them into permanent voters, but then they step into running for local office. And that's how democracy is being built from the bottom up. That's why Airlift goes on and on. After the election, of course, we have to win this election. That's a no-brainer. But the good news is that nobody's going away. The groups continue. So what I would like to say, we did want to ask you something today. If you think about it, you are supporting our groups in doing this amazing work of finding people, reaching out to them, then educating them and engaging them and signing them on for the long haul. Now that is our job here, so that we can continue to support them. What we're hoping from you is simply to spread the word to your friends and people that you think would be likely to be as generous with their donations as you are. We have something called a power hour. It does take about an hour, probably less than we're taking tonight, but sorry, probably my fault. And it's succinct, to the point. You sit back with a glass of wine, you invite your friends, they go on Zoom, and literally within 20 minutes to half an hour, they've gotten all the information they need. They're fully inspired, and by gosh, they donate. They donate, and they agree to have their own house parties, their own power hours. That would be. We hold your hand through the whole thing, and really we just need your Rolodex, because my Rolodex is exhausted. There's not an old boyfriend left, not a relative, no one, not even a dog down the street that hasn't heard from me. So I kind of need you guys now to help, right? So there is the thing that there's a lot going on right now, and perhaps it's just too much on your calendar to even think about a guest list, okay? So there's always the old standby, and we're good with it, which is simply just dig deep, reach into your pocket, and make a big fat donation. That works too. At this late hour, we need anything and everything. So in the chat that you know, where you can put your questions, you can put your pledge. You can put a pledge to host an event, which we will help you all the way through, or you can make a nice, generous pledge. And I encourage everyone to pledge now while you're feeling inspired and emotional, like I am, like I feel like I'm about to cry. Because if you wait till tomorrow, you might, I'm gonna give it a little, really, right now, plus we need it right now. We need your help, we need your friends, we need it all. This is the most important election of our lifetime, obviously. So I'm just gonna end with, did I cover everything? The chat, yes. I want to say Barack Obama is my favorite man. And he said, when you think you've done all you can do, do more. And that's how I feel. And can I just say thank you so much for your support. By seeing Dakota speak, you realize the people that you are supporting and what amazing work. Sorry, I said amazing, Jenny. The impactful work that they are doing. Thanks for coming, you guys. I'm going to hand it over to Danny. He's going to sign us off.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was great. I will not say the word amazing. I want to say one thing about last night's debate. The millions of young people, the Black and brown people who are part of our movement, do not relate to two old white guys in suits who don't talk about what matters to them. What we learned today is that we need to get closer to the pain We need to meet these people where they are, find out what's important to them, what they think would make their lives better. And that's the work we're supporting. Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and good night. And here we are for anybody who wants to stay on for a few minutes and chat, or
I see this, Michael. You will be hearing from us.
That sounds mildly threatening, but I can't wait.
It's so fun.
oh my God.
Yeah,
No,
that's,
it's true. It's true. I've been trying to get. I have a lot of friends. I've been trying to get them involved, trying to inspire them to donate, and they're the kind of people who I think are generally even more progressive than me, but also kind of shell-shocked and or cynical, and I don't know what really moves them. So, yeah, maybe this will be an interesting thing to do.
Great.
There's a lot of shell-shocked people walking around.
And you know now, having seen her, that Liz is going to make it fun for you.
that's my motto. If you're not having fun, you're fired.
I don't think you're going to find that on the Chinese production line.
No.
In fact, my husband saw on the Chinese production line, one of them, they said, work harder or you'll be fired.
Lovely.
Yeah.
This was in the swing band that I sang in for 40 years. That was our motto. If you're not having fun, a little different.
Right.
That's a different story in a
Different story.
Yeah.
Hi, David.
Hi. I was starting to write another chat, so I can just chat now and talk, real time. If I understand what was said earlier, and I'm just new to this, I was introduced to Airlift by some people we really respect. The money that's being raised now and will continue to be raised is partly intended to fund these ongoing operations, but also partly directed at an anticipated need for November 3rd elections being a protracted episode. Am I hearing all that right?
Yes.
So the money would fund not only the stuff that's going on, some of which is very long-term and fantastic, some of which is directly focused on getting a fundamental regime change here, and anticipating that there's going to be a lot of unusual barriers to that, and so the money is being directed to the people that are going to undo those barriers for folks. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, I think you got it right. I think the voting happens at the local level, and there's these are local officials who are running this stuff. There's been some stress testing, but nowhere near as much as should have happened. But we have all these kind of trigger events that we've been having that show people like the things that can go wrong. And so, as Dakota alluded to, there's contingency plans at the local level. They're part of networks at the national level that are helping them with these plans. And so, unlike 2016, I think it's fair to say that we're going to be ready for anything and everything. Doesn't mean, that's different from being effective and winning, but that's really all you can do, is to anticipate, to prepare, to make sure you have adequate funding and staffing and plans to, and also to be part of networks where the information travels very fast. I mean, the learning across these networks is phenomenal. And it's just something that I find inspiring. And that's why I asked Dakota about the cooperation between the groups, because we have this kind of monolithic notion about the Democratic Party running things, and so it's like it's all coming down from the top. Well, in these local situations, it ain't coming down from the top. There's a fairly robust Democratic Party in Wisconsin now because it's under new leadership and inspiration, but that's kind of an exception, and they're not doing the heavy lifting in the minority communities.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, David.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you. I don't even remember how much we kicked in, so I was kind of shocked to find out that we were among your bigger donors. Not super wealthy people, so
Yeah, well,
I don't remember how much we kicked in, but I'm when I heard about y'all, it was one of the bigger donations that we made, and then what I did was I created a little PDF with links to different ways of helping out in November, and made sure that that Airlift was one of those links. And,
Thank you.
and that went out to, not thanks to me, but thanks to some women friends, literally hundreds of people. So what I was thinking of doing was getting another one together and posting it on Facebook and getting it out to that same network, that much bigger than mine, about stuff you can still do,
Yeah.
stuff that's still critical. And I've received some suggestions about specific races and
Yeah.
way move on slicing and dicing, and other people are doing that in the Democratic Senate committee. But this seems like one that people would want to know about, so I'll just make sure to include that. And I don't know where we are with our giving, frankly. My wife and I are just adding up. We just been help me defeat Lindsey Graham on this or that. Oh, okay. That's $50 now. I have absolutely no idea how much money we've done. So we're going to take a look at that before we make any more donation decisions. But that one mailing was pretty effective, and I never heard about you guys 2 weeks before I sent that thing. So thanks for keeping all the great work. It's pretty critical, and I think you're doing exactly what needs to be done long term.
Yeah, thank you.
So do we.
Oh,
So thank you.
Thank you, David.
we'll be here in January.
I'm going to sign out and keep me on your mailing list here.
Oh, you're on it. Don't worry.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Carol, did you see my question?
No, I didn't see what.
I was just asking you, have you got all of the chat recorded? Or
The chat, yes, I'm going to stop the recording now of the